The first time Rhea Calder stepped into the depot, the wind moved through it like a body that had given up its ghost. She could taste the rot at the back of her throat, old pine, coal dust, and the iron breath of rails that no longer hummed. Sunlight barged through broken panes and fell in diagonal bars across pigeon droppings, warped benches, and a departure board stuck forever at a date 19 years in the past. She stood in the middle of what had been the waiting hall and felt the floor hesitate. The boards were soft, like they were deciding if they'd hold her or send her through to the dirt. Before she let herself smile, she made herself breathe. In, out. Count the ribs of the roof. Note the pitch of the wind. Listen to the quiver in the walls. A building was a throat, and if you listened, it told you whether it meant to speak again. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. There was still a red auction tag on the front door, the ink washed to a pink ghost, Lot 17, Railway Terminal Number 2, ASIS. A hangnail price stabbed at the bottom in blocky county handwriting, $500. Her thumb worried the edge of the tag while she walked. The ticket window had a crack that split the glass into two triangles, like a slow-motion blink. Faded timetables lay slumped on the counter, stiff with dust. She could almost hear the echo of an evening train and someone's quick footsteps across the tiles. She could almost be that person, late, breathless, halfway out of a town that liked its familiar opinions. Rhea pulled the folded deed from her jacket. Her name had been typed in. Calder, Rhea Ann. She read it once, twice, as if repetition could anchor it into the world. The paper felt like a dare. Her hands were steady, but her heart did a delicate stutter when she pictured the faces at the auction, the cough of laughter hand to mouth, the way Mr. Garner from the feed store muttered, "She could have bought a good pickup with that," and the little agreement murmurs that followed like gnats. A gust punched through a shattered clerestory panel and sent a soft avalanche of plaster from the proscenium arch above the old platform doorway. Instinct made her step aside. The dust fell where she had just been standing. The fall exposed a band of hand-painted ivy leaves, colors still stubborn under grime. She reached up and touched the paint with 2 fingers. The green answered her finger with the faint powder of age, but beneath it the pigment clung the way ivy clings, rootlets insisting into mortar. She imagined the men who had stood on scaffolds 100 years ago, their brows damp, their palms stained with mineral color. Someone had believed enough in this place to paint vines on it. "Okay," she said aloud to the birds in the rafters and the squat stove with its cracked belly. "You and me, then." The town had many names for Rhea: quiet, odd, headstrong. She kept the ones that worked and shed the rest like a coat she'd outgrown. She worked as a machinist and welder for a contractor who patched road graders and snowplows, mostly. Her wrists were the kind that never quite fit bangles. Her hands taught themselves to remember the weight of an acetylene torch, the talkback of sheet metal, the exactness of a flange that refused to lie. She had not ever owned a building. She had owned the feeling that buildings gave her, when she stood inside them and listened, the way she listened now. Through the missing panes she could see the tracks, 2 parallel rust-burnt lines, one drowned in weeds, one still shiny where freight crawled through town at 3 in the morning. She had watched those trains from the bridge as a kid, counting boxcars like rosary beads, mouthing the names of far places stamped on their sides. Somewhere had always been the answer to a question she didn't know how to ask yet. The depot wasn't somewhere. It was here. Unfashionable, unphotogenic, its bricks flaking like old paint, its eaves hitching up at the corners as if trying to remember the shape of a smile. The roof sagged in the middle. The freight dock had a bite taken out of it where a truck had smashed into the corner. A train bulletin board still listed a night run to Salt Fork at 11:12 p.m., though the tracks to Salt Fork had long been torn up and turned into a jogging trail. She walked the perimeter first. "Inspect like you mean to love," her father used to say about engines, and she applied it to everything. The western wall leaned. The mortar there had lost its mind. She crouched and pressed her fingers into it. They came away with a chalky crumble. The foundation stones on that side were only wet on the surface. That meant the downspouts were dumping their gilt straight down the wall, not carrying it away. Fixable. The northern eave had a run of carpenter bee holes as neat as flute fingerings. The main doors were a quilt of boards that didn't agree with one another. The iron brackets that had once held a station clock were still embedded over the doors, and in the sockets, tiny birds had soldered nests of grass and hair. She took pictures with her phone and scribbled a list. It was an unruly M of tasks: shore wall, jack beam, sister rafters, engineered trusses, salvage heart pine, sweep nests gently, rent scaffolding, borrow mortar pan from Jim. Call Miss Irene about the historical register, do not let her talk you out of it. Find someone with a crane and mercy. Her breath turned to steam as she worked. April had come cold and reluctantly. She had a week before the contractor job ramped into overtime. If she meant to do the dangerous parts by herself, if she was going to put her hands on the bones before the town could decide whether to call the county inspector, the paper, or her mother, then it needed to be now. The first hit of the pry bar into the freight dock gave her a blast of cedar smell, like a cupboard opening to a different century. Beneath the splintered fascia board, the joists were gray and furred with rot, but the beams tucked deeper, when she cut a test slice with her saw, were redder, tight-grained, old-growth heart pine. The kind that sank in water. The kind that rang when you tapped it. "Hello," she murmured, touching the fresh-cut face. "You've been waiting." Waiting was a kind of loyalty. By noon her shoulders burned. By 2 she had uncovered the first of the metal tie rods that ran through the freight dock substructure. It was bowed, but not broken. She set a bottle jack under the most shamefaced sag, built cribbing from the less rotten timbers, and began a slow, patient lift until the freight dock exhaled. The room changed pitch. Even the pigeons stilled as if listening. The wind thumped once into the new tightness. She smiled, and the smile felt like a secret. "Miss?" The voice came from the doorway. Rhea set down her hammer and turned. A girl stood there in a jacket 3 sizes too big for her and boots with laces doubled around the tops. 12, 13. The jacket had a train company's patch on it, mid-county lines, bent with age. "You shouldn't be in here without a hard hat," Rhea said, gentle. The girl's chin went up. "You're Rhea Calder." "And you are?" "June." The chin stayed up as if it had been set there with a wrench. "My grandmother says you paid $500 for our station." Our station. That warmed something in Rhea she hadn't realized was cold. "It wants to work again," she said. "It's tired of being laughed at." June took a step inside. She looked like someone who lived in ideas. Her eyes belonged to a person who took things apart and put them back together when the adults weren't looking. "You going to make it a coffee shop?" The very thought made Rhea's arms go stiff. "No." "A boutique?" "No." June frowned at the ceiling, at the ivy paint exposed by the fallen plaster, at the old ticket window. "A museum?" "They always say museum, and then nobody goes." Rhea liked the way the kids said they, like a group you could choose not to belong to. "Something else," she said. "Something useful. Something we haven't had in a long time." "What?" Rhea hesitated. Not because she didn't know the answer, but because you had to introduce a wild idea like a skittish horse. You didn't blurt, you offered your hand and waited. "A place that listens," she said. June's eyebrows did a skeptical dance. "Buildings don't listen." "They do," Rhea said, and she pointed at the tie rod. "That groan, when I took the weight. That was the dock saying thank you. And when freight goes through at 3 a.m., the whole roof hums in E-flat. You can make a hall that holds that note and answers it." "A music place?" "A listening place," Rhea said. "Music, yes. But also speeches, and a town hall where that isn't a fight, and a space where kids can take apart old motors without anyone telling them it's dangerous or stupid. Somewhere to bring people when the plant shuts down again and we all forget how to breathe." June's face did something complicated, like sunlight figuring out a path through leaves. "You're going to build it?" "Yes," Rhea said. She didn't say with what money. She didn't say how long it would take. She placed her hand on the beam again and let the red of the wood stain her skin. Inside here. June stepped forward, then stopped at the threshold. My grandmother says the station is haunted. She says there's a sealed room the men closed up the day my grandfather got laid off, and they never opened it again. Rhea looked at the proscenium, at the plaque that had probably carried a station name before someone unscrewed it. The plaster workmanship was good, too good for a town this small to have afforded unless, once upon a time, it had been a proud stop. She tracked the seam lines with her eyes. Old buildings like to hide things. Your grandmother is probably right, she said. But ghosts like it when you listen. Can I help? June's voice was quick. You can bring me whatever stories your grandmother remembers, Rhea said. And tell me what you want in a place that listens. June grinned, all teeth and angles. Tools. Soldering irons. Wi-Fi. A stage. A stage is listening with a spine, Rhea said, and when June looked at her like that wasn't a real thing, Rhea laughed. We'll start with a brace for the western wall, so your stage doesn't end up outside every time the wind gets dramatic. June watched while Rhea measured and cut, her questions a quick patter. Why do you mark with a carpenter's pencil and not a Sharpie? Why does the saw sound different in the middle? Why do you talk to the wood? Because it talks back, Rhea said, and she set the brace in place and felt the wall lean into it and relax. By the time the light went lavender behind the ridgeline, June's grandmother had appeared at the doorway, her scarf knotted low, her eyes bright with my idea different from yours. Irene? Rhea guessed. The old woman's mouth twitched. Miss Irene DeMost. You're the one who bought this. I am. Why? Rhea gestured at the ivy paint, at the beams, at the way even the brokenness held a kind of perfect. Because it said please. Miss Irene snorted in a way that wasn't all dismissal. You talk like my late husband. He kept a tuning fork in his lunch pail and tapped every beam in this place, like a man checking a heart. I could use a tuning fork, Rhea said. Miss Irene peered in, eyes going watery and sharp all at once. They closed the express room when the last station master retired. Said there wasn't enough money in parcels anymore, with the highway stealing everything. They sealed it up and painted over the doorway. I told them, that room's always been a friend. But nobody asked the building. Rhea glanced at June, who was trying not to vibrate. Can you show me? Miss Irene stepped inside like she was entering a church where she knew the pews would recognize her knees. She walked directly to the right of the ticket window, to an expansive wall that looked like ordinary plaster. She put her palm to it, then drew an invisible shape, her hand remembering a doorknob. Here, she said. Behind this. Rhea crouched. The baseboard wore a sweater of paint. She ran her fingertips along it until she found the faintest syllable of a seam. June, she said, not looking up, there's a pry bar by the jack. Bring it gently. June moved like someone in a temple. Rhea worked the tip into the seam and wiggled until old nails thought about their options. The first pop was the sound of a buried breath. Miss Irene made a sound in her throat that was half laugh, half cry. They pulled, together, until the board came away, and behind it, the outline of a door didn't exactly reveal itself so much as admit it had been there the whole time. They had painted over the knob. It was brass beneath the scab. Rhea scraped at it with her thumbnail until it winked. June looked like she wanted to explode into fireworks and recite an oath of allegiance to doorways. Moment of truth, Rhea said. If it sticks, we back off. Old wood has its own schedule. She tried the knob. It didn't move. She leaned a shoulder into it, feeling for the give that would say okay, I'll let you in if you promise to treat me right. Something yielded. The slit of a gap appeared, and with it a wave of air that smelled like paper and apples and cold iron. The express room had been sleeping for 2 decades. Rhea angled her head and peered in. Shelving lined the walls, laden with parcels wrapped in twine and brown paper. Labels had curled at the edges, the bold letters of names and towns had gone soft with time. A bicycle leaned on a stand, a woven basket still strapped to its handlebars. A crate labeled piano keys sat next to a wooden wardrobe with a chalk scrawl, "Calder, hold until Friday." The sight of her own name made her throat compress. She realized she was grinning like a fool. June got there first with a flashlight she produced from the pocket of her too-large jacket. She shone it across the room, and the light picked up a metal box on the far table, thin and long, with a wax seal stamped into its lid. The seal carried a symbol Rhea recognized from old postcards, a winged wheel. Miss Irene touched the doorframe and said something so soft Rhea didn't catch it. Rhea stepped in, careful of the dust that wasn't really dust anymore so much as the quiet of things resisted. The room had a hush like a library that had been waiting to forgive you. She ran her fingertips along the spine of a parcel and felt the twines bite. Many of the things here had probably been abandoned, not through malice, but because somebody moved, or somebody died, or the road found a faster way of saying goodbye. That box, June breathed. What is it? Rhea put her hands under it, and felt its weight. Not heavy, dense like a decision. The wax seal was intact. She held it up so Miss Irene could see the wheel and wing's impression. The old woman's mouth opened a little. I haven't seen that since, she closed it again. Since I was a girl. Should we open it? June's voice squeaked with the kind of hunger that made Rhea want to protect her from everything and hand her a wrench. It isn't ours, Rhea said, though something in her knuckles vibrated like a tuned string. But we can listen. How do you listen to a box? You knock. Rhea rapped her knuckles lightly against the lid. The sound came back close and honest, no hollows, no rattle. She turned the box and read the faded ink on one end, for delivery upon reopening. Miss Irene laughed out loud then, the sound rinsed with old tears. Some stationmaster had a sense of humor. Or a sense of prophecy, Rhea thought, and the idea rose in her like an elevator, effortless and terrifying. They left the box on the table and set to the work of excavating gently, cataloging with their eyes, not their hands. Miss Irene sat on a stool and told stories, the lunch whistles, the winter coal fires, the velvet curtain that once hung where the proscenium arch now showed ivy. She told them about the time a traveling violinist missed his connection and played for the night shifters in the waiting hall until Coffee learned how to waltz. June soaked it up like the board soaked up sunlight. At dusk, with the freight schedule inside Rhea's head like a metronome, they locked the express room and posted a note in clear handwriting on the sealed door, "Inventory in progress, please respect." People won't, Miss Irene said. Respect, I mean. They might, Rhea said. If we write it like a promise instead of a threat. She walked them to the front, where the last bruise of light held on. Out on Main, pickup trucks chewed the curb, and the neon in Greeley's diner flickered like a plea. Across the street, the paper's single-lit window glowed like a late confession. She could feel eyes from those places, curious, skeptical, measuring. Tomorrow, she said to June, bring your friends. What friends? June said, with exactly the frankness that made Rhea want to build her a kingdom. The ones who like to take things apart, Rhea said. We're going to build scaffolding. We're going to save this roof, then make it sing. June saluted with absurd seriousness, then stumbled when her two big bootlaces tangled. Rhea caught her by the elbow and righted her. I can pay you in pizza, Rhea said. And in letting you use a soldering iron without talking down to you. June's grin flashed. I'm in. That night, Rhea stayed late. She set a camping cot in the ticket office and left the door cracked to hear the building sleep. She watched the moon put a coin in the slot of every broken window and listened to the rails whisper down past the bridge as the 2 a.m. freight eased through like a careful animal. When the engine's horn called, 3 short notes and a long, the roof answered. It was faint and holy itself, a long chord, a body remembering a hymn. She turned on her side and pressed her ear to the floor. She felt the hum go into the bones. Tears jumped to her eyes, not sadness, not joy, just the surprise of finding exactly the sound you'd been missing and not knowing you'd been missing it. Okay, she told the dark, the rafters, the express room, the box with its winged seal and its patience. I hear you. In the morning, the town came. Not all of it, and not with flags. But they came like people who had been told there was a woman at the depot who thought Oldwood should get a second try, and that rumor is a kind of ticket. The first to show was Mr. Garner from the feed store, his skepticism ironed and folded under his arm. He leaned on the scrap metal barrel and looked at the jacks as if they were a performance he might review grudgingly later. "Mornin'," he said, like he was trying out the word. "Mornin'," Rhea said back, and handed him a pair of gloves without making eye contact. "If you're going to stand there, you might as well catch the boards I drop." He took the gloves like they might bite. 10 minutes later, he was catching boards like you couldn't pry them away from him. Then came Tilda from the paper with a notebook she tried to hide, and beside her, Pastor Leon, who had a sawzall in his truck and the look of a man who believes in both grace and bracing. After that, 3 teenagers in black hoodies slid in, eyes scanning everything like raccoons. June followed with 2 classmates she had probably bribed with promises of sparks and pizza. By noon the freight dock looked less like a wound and more like an argument that might yet be settled. Rhea moved like the kind of conductor who didn't like anyone to know she was conducting. "You, hold here. You, watch the plumb line. You, don't stand under anything that could decide it's a bird." June ran messages the way kids run, like her bones wanted to be useful. She took ownership of the scrap sorting, copper here, steel there, don't touch that lead paint unless you want to have a very unpleasant week. She stuck notes to piles with painter's tape, her handwriting big and stubborn, roof good. Roof bad but pretty. Rhea kept 2 operations going at once to keep time from finding enough air to grow doubts. At 2, a woman Rhea didn't recognize marched in with a roll of printed petitions and a mouth ready to declare. "You can't just open a dangerous site without permits," the woman said without hello. "I'm on the Historical Society. We have procedures." Rhea wiped sweat with the back of her wrist. "I like procedures," she said, which was true when they were well-made ones. "I also like not letting the western wall fall on a child. Would you like to sign in and hold a 2x8 while we keep the roof attached to the planet?" The woman went pink and then a newer color Rhea couldn't name yet. She held a 2x8. By 4, they had a choir. People who didn't like each other pretended they did. The building began to wear the beginnings of a scaffold like a borrowed coat that fit surprisingly well. The town's sound changed, less of the gossip whisper through Greeley's windows, more of a rhythm that recognized itself in hammers. At 5, when the light turned the train rails into twin strings of nickel, a white truck edged up with County Inspector stenciled on its door. Rhea's throat tightened, but she made her mouth into courtesy. The inspector climbed down, a square man whose boots remembered ditches. He took in the jacks, the cribbing, the braces, the scaffold that had been assembled with algebra and prayer. "You called her?" "Yes, sir." "You know you need permits?" "Yes, sir," she said, and gestured. "I also know gravity doesn't. We're catching what's falling and putting it back where it goes. No occupied loads, no electrical hookups, no power tools other than what the human brain qualifies as power. I'll file for retroactive after we finish not dying." He had the corners of a smile hidden in the folds of his face. "I saw your daddy rebuild a combine once with a bent spanner and a jar of stubborn. He didn't have a permit neither." Rhea looked at the ground so he wouldn't see the way that sentence undid and remade her. "He taught me to label my scrap." The inspector walked the perimeter, muttering to himself, "Good cribbing. Overbuilt. Lord save me, I like overbuilt." He stopped at the express room sign and touched the note with one finger. "That door was always rumored." "It isn't rumor anymore," Rhea said. "You open it." "We found it. We didn't take anything." "Good," he said. "Write me a letter and tell me what you're doing and why. I'll pretend I received it last week." He squinted into the rafters and shook his head. "They built these places like they thought war would come through them. It did. Different kinds." "Thank you," she said, meaning it bigger than the conversation. He tipped 2 fingers off his temple like a salute and got back in his truck. By evening, June and her new cronies had chalked a rough stage rectangle on the freight dock and were arguing about sight lines with the suspiciously efficient passion of children finding their first chance to argue about something that matters. Rhea let them. She had learned with machines and with people, you don't interrupt a healthy argument unless it starts to eat its own hands. She climbed the scaffold, one careful rung at a time, to confront the roof where it caved. The view from the top was the town's bad haircut, a patchwork of shingle and tar and the sudden shine of distant river. The wind tugged at her jacket like a friend who didn't know its own strength. She measured the slope in the rafter run and made the calculations that lived like a second language in the back of her head. Her breath came hard, not because of fear, but because she was making something, and the body always protested before it surrendered to the work. She heard the ladder creak below and did not look down. "Don't come up," she said. "We're at the awkward part between unsafe and fixed." "Not climbing," said Miss Irene, which meant she was halfway up. "I'm bringing you this." Rhea peered over the parapet. Miss Irene held up a cloth-wrapped package the size of a book. "From the express room," she said. "Not stolen. Ours. My husband wrote my name on it in chalk." Rhea took it because refusing would have been a violation of some law older than the county's. She unwrapped the cloth and found a tuning fork, clean and bright, the note stamped into its spine, of 440. "We won it at a company picnic in 1963, Irene said. "He used it every time he ever fixed anything in here. Said there wasn't a beam in this place that wasn't a string if you had the right ear." Rhea's throat did that surprise ache again. She held the fork by the stem and tapped it against the heel of her palm. It sang, simple and small and exactly true. Rhea touched it to the beam. The beam answered. Quietly, but with a kind of gratefulness that felt like the building had taken her hand. "Now," she said, "not to anyone in particular." She tightened the last bolt on the sister rafter, felt it draw down with a purr. The roof cinched itself up a fraction. The scaffold steadied. The ladder sighed under Miss Irene's steady retreat. That night, the rain came. It came in a long diagonal, like a thought you can't quite catch. It came with gusts that made the depot lick its wounds. Rhea slept in the ticket office again, but this time her sleep had a sentinel in it. When the freight passed, the roof hummed and the rain harmonized. She knew where the leaks were by the sound and made notes in the dark. Pails at entry, roofing felt tomorrow, ask Leon about tar. The morning brought 2 new volunteers and 1 new opponent, Councilman Horace Strode, who wore his yardage of disapproval like a sash. "This is a liability," he said, as if the word had power to stop bolts from drawing down. "If someone gets hurt." Rhea waited until he finished inventing disasters. "If someone gets hurt," she said, "we will have an ambulance on the way in 12 minutes in a building that's halfway saved instead of halfway collapsed. If you have a better proposal that doesn't require a bonfire of money we don't have, I'll listen." He did not have one. He had a harumph. He left with it intact. By lunch they had the western wall straightened to the place where plumb lines loosened their shoulders. Rhea sat on the freight dock with her boots dangling and ate a sandwich that had, sometime between morning and noon, turned into a communal miracle. Everybody brought something, and the somethings added up to lunch. June sat cross-legged beside her with a bolt in each fist like hand weights. "What do you do when they laugh at you?" June asked around a mouthful. "You build while they're laughing," Rhea said. "It confuses the laugh." June nodded seriously, as if this were a theorem she could apply to algebra later. "Tonight," Rhea said, thinking aloud because the scaffolding had tuned her thoughts into music, "we'll try the lights." "What lights?" June said, eyes bright. "The ones we make," Rhea said. "From what's here?" "Old railroad lanterns we can rewire. Strings of bulbs with low draw. We'll run them off a generator I can borrow from work. We'll light the hall the way it was lit when people believed in trains as a kind of future." June's grin was so quick it looked like a heartbeat. "We can work after dark." "We'll work until the town can't help but come look," Rhea said, and realized as she said it that it might be the most dangerous thing she'd dared yet. The afternoon was all ladders and wire strippers and the peculiar smell of ancient porcelain sockets giving up their stubborn. Pastor Leon came back with spools of cloth-wrapped wire and, miracle of miracles, 2 tarnished chandeliers rescued from a church remodel, their bones still good if you listened past their dust. Tilda took photographs like she had decided to tell a different kind of story than the one she had expected. Mr. Garner stayed, and at 4:30 he said, "Well, if we are going to do it, we might as well do it right," and fetched his flatbed with the oak planks he'd been saving for a Sunday deck he no longer cared about. At dusk, Rhea stood in the middle of the hall and looked up. The chandeliers hung like promises. The rewired lanterns stood on the counters like sentries. The ivy paint had been coaxed further out of hiding, careful patch by careful patch. The floor had a clean lane swept down its center, June's work evidenced by chalk notes in the margins: danger, nails. Safe, dance. Ready? June whispered, and the whisper ran around the room, through Irene and Leon and Garner and the teenagers and even Tilda with her Mantis camera. Rhea felt the tuning fork in her back pocket like a second heart. She went to the generator outside and primed it with a gravity that made silence gather under people's shoes. She checked the lines. She checked the load. She looked up at the sky, full dark, the town's few lights held like lighters at a concert nobody would admit to attending. Moment of truth, she said again, remembering the door, the wax seal, the note for delivery upon reopening. She pulled the cord. The generator coughed, hiccuped, then came to a steady idle. The cloth-wrapped lines vibrated like catgut strings finding pitch. The smallest of the lanterns flickered, held its breath, then found its filament and glowed, the kind of warm that isn't about heat but about permission. One by one, they came up. The hall breathed. Rhea felt tears threaten again and refused them with a smile that hurt her cheeks. The chandeliers woke like old queens in good light. The teenagers hooped before remembering they were supposed to be unimpressible. Outside, people gathered on the sidewalk the way birds gather on a wire when they don't know why yet. "Music," Miss Irene said softly. "Not yet," Rhea said. "First the room has to remember how to be a room." But the room did what rooms do when they are finally noticed, it answered. Even in the hum of the generator, there was a new frequency, something between a promise and a bow being drawn across a string. It ran up Rhea's spine and out across her shoulders and into her fingers. She lifted her hand and the building lifted with it, like a partner who had been waiting for you to ask. "Stage," June whispered, urgent, and pointed. They had chalked only the outline, but the light made it a thing. Rhea stepped onto it and felt the boards beneath, the surviving ones, say yes, we can hold you if you promise to hold us back. "Friends," Pastor Leon said, easy into a voice that could carry without shouting. "It seems we had a station and we forgot. And now it remembers us," Tilda murmured, pencil shaved raw. Rhea held up her hands and they quieted, the people inside, the people at the doors, the people who'd come because light at night is an invitation. "This isn't an opening," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "It's a test. We're seeing what this hall wants to be when it grows up. We're listening with our hands and our eyes and our feet. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to learn. But tonight, we're going to ask a question." She reached into her pocket and took out the tuning fork. She tapped it against her palm and put it to the mic stand June had conjured from 2 broom handles and a hose clamp. The claret filled the space and then hooked itself into the bones of the room. The chandeliers shivered as if someone had told a fine joke. "Now," Rhea said. "Listen." The faraway freight horn called, 3 short, 1 long. The rails picked up. The floor carried it like a rumor turned true. The tuning forks met the freight's note and for a breath, in fact for 3 breaths, something aligned. It wasn't music in the usual sense. It was the sound of a place arriving at itself. Someone laughed, a sound that broke into a cry without its permission. Rhea swallowed hard. June was trembling like a wire. And then, because the town is always both generous and difficult, something went wrong. A blue spit of light popped from a junction near the express room. The second chandelier flickered like it had changed its mind. the generator grumbled. A wire on the west wall cracked its cloth skin and showed angry copper. Off, Rhea said, not loudly, and people scrambled the way flocks do when the wind surprises them. She ran to the breaker box she'd rigged on a plank and tripped the main. Darkness took them in one swallow, then, after the shock, the kind of cheering that isn't about victories so much as relief. "You okay?" she asked the generator, patting its cowl like an apologetic friend. It muttered back in fumes. She fanned it and it sneezed out a cough and went quiet. "Everyone good?" Pastor Leon called. Replies came from the dark like fireflies agreeing to be lit later. "Could have been worse," Mr. Garner said, sounding more impressed than words will admit. Rhea stood very still and let the dark print itself on her retinas. She found the hum she wanted, the one that said nobody had been hurt, nothing fatal had failed, and the room had learned the shape of light. "Tomorrow, new wire," she said. "Lower load. Independent circuits. And conduit. We're not going to tempt fate twice." The freight went by, slow as a sermon. In its wake came a wind that found every new seam they had tightened and tugged at them the way water does with shorelines. Rhea put her hand on the nearest beam, and the beam said, "I'm with you." People drifted out in twos and threes, their voices warmer than when they had drifted in. June refused to leave until she had swept the hazard piles into bossy order. Tilda asked if she could come back tomorrow with a different lens. Pastor Leon stayed to help coil the betrayed extension cords into circles of penitent snakes. Miss Irene put a hand on Rhea's cheek the way only certain elders can. "You made the wall so it would hear again," she said. "It'll pay you back." Rhea wanted to say, "We don't do it for payback." Instead she said, "Thank you for the fork." "Keep it," Irene said. "It likes you." When Rhea was alone again, the depot rolled its knuckles and settled. She went to the express room door and laid her palm on the paint. The wax-sealed box waited inside with its puzzling instruction. For delivery upon reopening. She pictured it under the light of a single lantern. She pictured June reading over her shoulder, Miss Irene holding her breath, the paper bending its ear. She pictured what it would be like to open it. Not yet, she told the box, and surprised herself by how tender the refusing felt. "We're not open. We're listening. And we're building the thing that will make opening mean something." It snowed the next morning, because spring is a practical joker. Fine flakes, quick to melt on her gloves, but stubborn enough to make the scaffold sulk. Rhea adjusted the day's plan and moved the crew inside. She assigned stations like a conductor with an orchestra of old friends who didn't know yet that they were old friends. Sweeping, sorting, prying. She put the hoodies on safe demo with crowbars and the instruction that if they found a mouse nest, they must immediately call someone who loved mice more than hammers. Councilman Strode returned with a photographer and a frown that had been polished to a dull shine. He lifted a hand as if he might declare the whole enterprise illegal by fiat. Tilda met him at the door. "Councilman," she said, voice like a rail, dry, straight, refusing to curve. "Tell me about the council's 5-year plan for what to do with the depot." He opened, closed, opened his mouth. "Ah," Tilda said, writing the word AH in her notebook. "I see." Strode deflated like something that had been overinflated with self. June, from her new post at the parcel table, whispered to Rhea, "You think we'll ever find money for this?" Rhea nodded once. "Money follows work," she said. "People pay for a train that's already rolling." "Even if it's just rolling inside a building," June said. "Especially then," Rhea said. By noon the snow had given up. The sky brightened into the kind of blue that feels like good news ran out of breath and had to sit down. Rhea took her sandwich to the freight dock and watched the town go past like a parade that hadn't quite learned its route. Someone in a red coat stopped and stared and cried and then pretended to be sneezing. A man she didn't know stood in the street and clapped once, like a single hand can carry a whole applause if it means it. At 2, a boy from the high school shop class arrived lugging a case like a samurai. Inside was a violin with a finish like old honey. "Mrs. Grilly said you'd let me try," he asked, thin-shouldered and brave to be here. Rhea thought of the story Miss Irene had told about the night shift concert. "We'll try in here," she said. "Just a scale." He tuned, cautiously. When he drew the bow, the room found another of its throats. The note lay against the chandeliers and turned them into fountains. People lifted their heads without knowing why. Rhea felt the hair rise on her arms. "Again," she said, and the bow obeyed, and the room woke like a creature interested in its own heartbeat. "We need to say it," Pastor Leon murmured at her shoulder. "Not just do it. Name it." "Name what?" "What it is," he said. "So the town has a word when they talk about it over meatloaf." Rhea looked at the stage, the lanterns, the express room, the chalk. She reached into her back pocket and touched the tuning fork. "Okay," she said. "We'll say it at 7. "Say what at 7? June said, appearing like a punctuation mark. "What this place is," Rhea said. "We'll tell them." At 6:30, the sidewalk had the twitchy energy of a story about to be told. The generators were ready, the circuits rebuilt, the chandeliers tested one by one. Rhea wore a jacket she didn't mind ruining, and under it the shirt her father used to wear when he wanted a project to go right. June wore a clean hoodie with the depot sketched on the back in chalk that would rub off and leave a memory on everyone who hugged her. The hall filled. Not to the walls, Rhea wouldn't let it, but enough that the room remembered what it was to hold a crowd. The boy with the honey violin stood on the chalk stage and looked like he might run. Miss Irene took a front bench and clasped her hands over her purse like she could keep the night in it if she needed to. Rhea stepped up, put her hand on the mic stand broom handle, and felt her mouth go dry, a reasonable response to the expectation rolling at her like a careful train. "When I was 8, she said, "I stood on the bridge over there and counted cars. I learned the names on their sides. I learned that a place can mean leaving and coming home at the same time. I bought this building because it asked to be something again. Not a coffee shop. Not a boutique. Something that belongs to all of us. A listening room. A maker's hall. A stage for the town when the world takes the microphone away. A shelter when we need shelter. A classroom without report cards. A place that hears before it talks." The hall held the words. Then it breathed them back warm. The chandeliers glinted like they approved. "We're calling it the Roundhouse," Rhea said, and the name sprang out of her like a spring that had found what it was made for. "Because roundhouses fix trains, and this one wants to fix people. Because it's a circle, we face each other. Because when the freight comes through at 3 a.m., the roof hums in a note we can answer." June's eyes went starry. Rhea took the tuning fork and tapped it. The boy lifted the bow. The generator started and a breath later the chandeliers came up, and this time, the lights held. The room shone like a heartbeat finally confident it can keep going. The boy played one note, A, and then a scale, careful as a person crossing ice and discovering the ice has decided to be generous. The freight did not come, it would not for 2 more hours. But people didn't need it. They made the sound themselves, a murmur, then a hum, then, to Rhea's astonishment, a chord. She felt something break and heal at once in her chest. Which is why she almost didn't hear the radio. The county scanner on Mr. Garner's belt hissed itself into words. He touched it like he was touching a flame. "Repeat," he said into it, voice suddenly stripped of everything but urgency. And then, louder, to the room, Freight 806 is reporting a problem at mile marker 31. They've lost brakes on grade. They're telling everyone to clear the line. The room went very quiet. Miss Irene's hands went white. The boy with the violin froze, his bow midair. "Mile 31, Pastor Leon said, calculating without moving his lips. That's 2 minutes out if it keeps speed. 3 if it rides the brakes." Rhea's mind flipped to a map that lived under her skin. Mile 31 was the long curve above the river, the place where the old retaining wall had spalled last winter. If a heavy freight missed the brake there, it would come into town like a confession that never learned how to end. "Everyone out," Councilman Strode shouted, in what might have been the first useful thing he'd said in a week. People pivoted, gathering children, catching coats. The chandeliers threw trembling light on faces learning fear. "Wait," Rhea said, and hated the word as it left her mouth. She wasn't telling them to stop. She was telling her own panic to wait. She looked at the freight timetable in her head and the generator and the tools and the bolts and the heavy chain Pastor Leon had brought because he'd known he'd need it for something. She looked at the depot, at the big doors that had seen arrivals and departures, grief and first kisses, winter and coal smoke and the day the last conductor folded his cap and wept. The building held its breath with her. "We can do something," she said. She didn't know exactly what. But she felt the sound the hall had made settle into the soles of her feet like a brace she could stand on. The scanner hissed again. 806 is coming in hot, repeat, coming in hot, requesting emergency diversion, yards not clear, brakeman reports, the rest was swallowed in static. 2 minutes. Maybe. "Rhea," June whispered, her eyes two moons. "What do we do?" Rhea's hand found the tuning fork and closed over it like it was a handle on a door to a different world. She felt the beam under her palm. She heard, in her blood, the roof's E-flat from the night before. She turned to the big doors and ran. "Leon, chain," she called. "Here." "Garner, truck." "Now." "On it." "June, signal." "How?" "The lanterns." Rhea said, and June flew, lit by a purpose so clear it erased hesitation. Rhea slammed the iron chute bolts back and heaved one door open until it grabbed in its hinges and howled. The night took the light the depot offered and flung it along the tracks. People spilled into the street in a fast river that didn't trample itself. The town breathed once like a chest that wasn't sure it could do another. The freight horn called from up the line, a sound now different, high, urgent, a voice that had run out of patience with procedure. Rhea planted her boots, grabbed the door chain, and turned to face the oncoming roar. The town didn't know yet what she had built inside the depot. They were about to find out. And just as she flung the chain toward Pastor Leon, the horn swelled, the lights bent around the far curve, and the ground began to shake. Shake. For a half-second the word was all Rhea could hold on to, shake in the timbers, in her legs, in the cords she'd thrown to Pastor Leon. Shake like a giant dog had put its paws on the town and was deciding whether to jump. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now, back to the story. The horn screamed again, closer now, not the conversational call of routine right-of-way but the high, ragged cry of steel pleading with gravity. Rhea took 3 running steps, caught the door chain Leon whipped to her, and looped it twice around the iron cleat that had once anchored mail carts. The metal bit her palm. Good. Pain was a hinge. "Lanterns," she shouted. "June." Already moving, June tore along the freight dock in that fearless, gawky sprint that belongs only to kids and creatures who haven't learned to doubt their feet. She snatched the rewired railroad lanterns from their posts and thrust them at the teenagers. "Red up. Red up," she barked with an authority borrowed from panic and purpose. Hoods disappeared into the night, scattering down the right-of-way in a string of ruby eyes. "Garner, truck." Rhea bellowed. The flatbed roared to life, lights flaring. Mr. Garner swung it parallel to the tracks, the oak planks rattling like bones in a maraca. "What's the play?" he yelled over engine and wind. "The west switch," Rhea said, pointing up the line where a shadow hunched like a crouched animal. "If it throws, it takes them into the yard instead of Main. Yard's a dead-end grade. They'll climb some, bleed speed." "That switch hasn't moved in 10 years, Garner warned. "Then tonight it remembers how," she said, and jumped from the dock to the ballast, her soles biting in. Gravel skittered like dice under her boots. Leon was already pounding toward the switch stand, chain over his shoulder like a sash of iron. 2 hooty kids overtook Rhea, one with a crowbar, one with a sledge, their faces white coins in the lantern glow. June ran beside them with a coil of rope bigger than her torso. The switch stand crouched at the edge of the light, its target plate black with weather, its handle frozen down, the lock rusted in. Rhea skidded to her knees beside it, shoved her gloves up, and jammed the pry bar under the latch. On my count, she said, voice calm because someone's had to be. 3, 2, now. Metal shrieked. The latch grudged up an inch, 2. Leon brought the sledge down on the lock, once, twice. Rust powdered the air like old cinnamon. Another hoodie kid, was that Alex, the quiet one from shop, slipped his crowbar into the seam and leaned his whole narrow life on it. The horn wailed. The curve spat light. Wind punched them, the foretaste of mass. Again. Rhea cried. The lock surrendered. The latch sprang. The handle still wouldn't budge. Chain, she shouted. Leon flung it, she caught it and looped it through the handle and around the post. Truck, she screamed toward Garner. He understood without words. The flatbed eased onto the gravel margin, tires biting mud. Rhea clipped the chain to the hitch with a farmer's quick hands. Gentle pull, she yelled. If it goes too fast, it'll shear. Garner nodded, jaw set like a vice. He eased the truck forward. The chain sang. The switch handle quivered, resisted, then moved the way frozen things move, suddenly, all at once, with a scream that lifted the hair on Rhea's arms. Keep it coming, she breathed. Keep it, stop. The target plate flipped from a ghost shape to a bold diamond. The points knit into the stock rail with a clunk you could feel in your teeth. Throw bar. Leon barked, and Alex dropped a wedge of scrap oak into the pocket to keep the points tight. Rhea leaped across the rails, lantern high, and saw the freight's eyes now, a pair of searing white circles rounding the far treeline, jittering, too fast. She knew terrible numbers without wanting to, tonnage, grade, momentum that could pulp brick and bone without noticing. She ran toward the center of the right-of-way, every nerve screaming at the idiocy of it, and swung the lantern in a slow, decisive arc, red, the oldest word in the language of steel. Rhea, someone yelled behind her. Back. But the lantern's arc was also a thought, we see you. We are not asleep. The town is awake and meeting you at the door. For a heartbeat the night was only glare and scream. Then, impossibly, an answering note, the engine's horn cut to a pattern, not panic but intent. Dynamic brakes wind up into a keening alto. The headlights bobbed, as if the lead unit's nose dipped in a nod to physics and prayer. The engineer saw her. Rhea ran backward, keeping the arc steady. She felt the freight's breath on her shins, hot and oily, and dove clear. Wind slapped her to the ballast as the lead unit blasted past, blue and white, mid-county line still naked on its flank under grime. She caught a flash of the engineer's face, a jaw like someone who kept promises, eyes wide and edged in fear. The loco hit the thrown points and shoved into the yard lead. Steel shrieked protest. The consist swayed, sickeningly, and then accepted the new path. The train began the slow climb up the slight grade, dragging its fear behind it in a ribbon of sparks. Rhea scrambled to her feet and ran alongside, counting cars because 8-year-old habits save towns. 1, 2, 8, 11. Coal gondolas, Leon panted at her shoulder. Heavy. Good, she said. Weight slows. Bad, he countered. Weight pushes. Both, she agreed, because truth rides 2 rails. Ahead, the yard throat curved toward the old bumper post, an iron and timber contraption at the very end of the stub, braced into a berm of cinder and granite they all called the pig pile. If the train ate that, it would chew, but it wouldn't run into Maine. Sand, she shouted, suddenly, the words surfacing from every manual she'd ever read when manuals were company. Alex veered toward the trackside sand house, an old, cone-top tower that had slept through 2 decades of not being needed. He scrambled up its ladder like a cat, found the valve by feel and faith, and spun it. Nothing. He swore, spun again. The mechanism coughed, belched a cloud of damp, then purred. Sand poured from the chute like an hourglass turning its mind. The engineer saw the plume and nodded the loco like a horse at a good idea. He cracked his independent, the handbrake for the engine alone. The sand took, gritted, raised the friction song. Come on, Rhea whispered to 5,000 tons of modernity. Come on, friend. Cars rattled past, truck springs screaming, couplers slack banging like ugly punctuation. The grade did its work. The dynamic brakes keened and then settled, just a hair. The beast began to remember it could be tamed. People who had fled the depot now lined the yard's fence at a safe, trembling distance, faces ghosted in lantern light, 100 collective prayers and 100 dialects of hope. June stood on the freight dock waving her own red lantern like a heartbeat. Rhea ran to the end of the stub where the bumper post waited and checked it with her hands like checking a friend's pulse. The old timbers were dry, streaked with creosote, bolted into a matrix of iron that went down into the pig pile like teeth into bread. Once upon a time, men with slide rules had overbuilt it because in those days overbuilding was a form of love. Leon arrived with the heavy chain, breath smoking. "We lash? Belt, suspenders, and a prayer," she said, and together they wrapped the chain around the bumper post and the old oak pilings behind it, binding the end of the world to itself. Garner reversed his truck to the very lip and braced its wheels against cribbing, a grim, ridiculous idea that still felt like exactly the human thing to do. "I am small, but I will hold." The lead unit howled. The consist groaned around the final bend, so close now that Rhea could read numbers off car sides as they knuckled past, AEX 50712. CNRX 3019. Each one a story, a cargo, a previous town's problem. Heads, someone screamed, because screaming is also a hinge. Rhea didn't move. She planted herself where the engineer could see her, lifted both hands, and held her palms out, easy easy easy. The engineer's eyes found hers again. In that instant something passed between them that wasn't words, a trust handed across a chasm and accepted. The engine hit the sanded stretch, the handbrake rashayed down to bone. The wheels bit. The couplers stretched and then compressed, a wave of force traveling backward like dominoes trying to remember their better nature. The lead unit's pilot kissed the bumper post. A crack shot through the air, not a failure but a physics. The chain sang a single furious note and held. The pig pile accepted the insult and pushed back like a broad palm. "Stop." Everything went white, then black, then still. The freight stood trembling, an animal just convinced not to run. Air hissed in exhausted relief. The horn stuttered twice, involuntary as breath returning. Rhea realized her own legs were shaking hard enough to blur the world. She leaned her forehead against the locomotive's steel, whispering nonsense to it the way you do to a dog that has almost bit you. "Good, good, good." The engineer opened his side window and leaned out, cap crooked, face streaked with sweat and grime and absolute gratitude. He started, and then laughed once because you have to let the body do something. "Who threw that switch?" "We all did," Rhea said. "Together." He looked at the lantern string curving back along the right-of-way, at June on the freight dock, at Leon and Garner and Alex with the crowbar like a baton. He closed his eyes for a beat and opened them again. "I hope you know you just saved this town." "We saved each other," Rhea said. "You saw us." "Couldn't not," he said, and then went quiet, listening to his own locomotive like a parent listening to a sleeping child. "I'll need to set handbrakes down the line. We'll tie her down proper and call it in. They'll send a relief set." "We'll walk with you," Rhea said. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." They walked the string and spun brakes by lantern light, a procession that felt like a ritual older than any of them. At every wheel, Rhea put her hand to the rim and felt the heat bleeding off like anger surrendering to shame. June strode along carrying chalk and wrote "thank you" on 3 coal cars because sometimes graffiti is prayer. By the time they got back to the depot, the town had started breathing again. Someone had made coffee that tasted like forgiveness. Tilda had made a photograph that would be on a wall in 10 years and make people cry all over again. Councilman Strode stood on the steps with both hands in his pockets like he had never used them, and for once he didn't speak. The engineer climbed down and offered his hand. Rhea took it. His grip had the weight of a man who turns wheels with his living. He hesitated, then reached into his cab and pulled out a leather satchel with the Mid-County logo half rubbed away. "This belongs here," he said. "It always did." "What is it?" June asked, bumping close because that's what gravity does when it's curious. Station master's kit, he said. Every old line kept one. We keep one too. Paper, flags, oil, a key for a door nobody remembers. Rhea felt something in her chest answer yes. There's a door, she said, voice gone careful. In the express room. Sealed. We found it. We didn't open the box. The engineer's eyebrows climbed. Box? Wax seal. Winged wheel, June said in a hot rush, eager as tinder. He laughed, a sound that was mostly wonder. Then I arrived exactly on time. The town followed them like children to the express room. Irene unlocked her memory and the door swung on the new hinges Rhea had oiled that very morning, as if buildings reward good manners on their own schedule. They set the long metal box on the table like an altar and stood around it, each person pretending to give the others room while giving themselves an alibi for their curiosity. Rhea looked at Irene. Irene looked at Rhea. The engineer set the satchel next to the box and untied its leather thong. Inside, paper envelopes, a red flag rolled tight, a brass key with teeth like a tiny skyline. Winged wheel, he said, tapping the key's bow. Rhea pressed her thumb to the wax on the box's lid. For delivery upon reopening, she read again, and felt the sentence tilt the room. Who delivers? June whispered. We all do, Rhea said, and slid the key into the box's hidden slot. It turned with a reluctant kiss, the sound of a thing pardoning you for being born late. Inside was not gold. It was better. Old paper, crisp as dry leaves. A ledger bound in blue cloth. A letter written in black ink in a hand that believed good penmanship was a civic duty. A small envelope sealed in red. And, wrapped in oiled cloth, a brass plate the size of Rhea's palm, engraved with a circle of words and the winged wheel at the center. Rhea lifted the letter first. Her hands shook in honest public ways. She held it so Irene could see over her elbow and June could read every third word out loud without meaning to. To the future station master, it began. The pen hand marched like a band leader. If this reaches you, then you have done what we hoped, you have reopened this house of passage. We closed in sorrow and under pressure of times. We sealed our tools and our stories. We also sealed a promise. Rhea swallowed and kept reading. Within is a ledger containing subscriptions, pledges and small sums from men and women of this town toward a fund for the station's next life. We could not know its name, only that it would serve neighbors. We have instructed the trustee to hold these subscriptions and their interest until such time as this room is lawfully open for public good. If no such opening, then the money goes to the library and the orphan house. If yes, then the money is yours, station master, to apply to the remaking of this place for listening and for gathering. June made a sound that was not a sound and Rhea kept reading to keep from making it, too. The keys included open the south safe and the clock case. The brass plate affirms that this station is, in perpetuity, a common house under the protective association of mid-county lines. The person holding the plate may at any time request assistance from this line's crews for the safety of the town. We know what storms do. We know what trains can give and what they can take. If you call, we will answer. Signed, Miriam Jessup, Station Master. April 3, 1942. 2 weeks after the last mail train. 2 days after her husband shipped out. Rhea's vision blurred. She tried to laugh and produced a noise like a sob. Her thumb found the tuning fork in her pocket as if it could hold her up. Say there is much else you wish for, the last paragraph concluded. But say first that you wish for neighbors to have a place to be. Put benches in. Keep the floor. Teach the young to listen. The rest will come. Rhea sat like someone had quietly removed a chair and replaced it with a better one. The ledger's cover cracked like an old greeting when she opened it. Names marched down the pages: Garner, Jessup, Greeley, Calder. $10 here. 2 there. 50 from the church. 100 from a widow who wrote in the margin, for the next song. Interest, Tilda said, eyes gone to math. 70 years of it. 83. Compound, Leon murmured. Multiplication with mercy. Rhea looked up at the engineer, who smiled like he'd watched a magic trick he'd helped set up decades ago by simply doing his job. Trustee, she asked. Mid-County kept a quiet account, he said. Some lines let their towns go hungry. Ours squirreled away what it could. That badge, he touched the plate with a respectful forefinger, means you can call us when you need muscle or machines. We needed you, Rhea said. And you called, he answered, meaning the lanterns and the switch and the woman in the middle of the right-of-way holding up her hands to physics. June was already doing the other math, the kind that makes a room big. We can wire real. Put in proper exits. Buy a board for sound. Build the stage. And the benches, Miss Irene said, fierce. And a maker lab, June added quickly, because you always say the thing you hope will happen before anyone can silence it. And rent a crane for the ridge, Garner threw in, trying to hide his softness inside a sentence about heavy equipment. And pay permits, Rhea said, aloud and on purpose, so the room would hear grown responsibility standing right beside Giddy Luck. The red-sealed envelope contained a bank certificate on paper that crackled like frost. The amount made Rhea sit down again. Modest by big city standards. Extraordinary by theirs. Enough to build trust into timber and wire. She turned back to the letter like a compass when you're lost in a generous forest and want to walk straight. At the bottom, in a loop of ink so neat it might have been printed, Miriam Jessup had added, P.S. This place hears trains in its bones. Build it so the trains can keep talking. You hear that? Rhea whispered to the roof. You're allowed. Words spilled into the town hotter than coffee. By noon the next day, the depot steps groaned under the weight of people who had questions in hands and sourdough starters. Strode arrived with 3 permit forms and a sheepish apology that almost tripped him. Rhea accepted both and put him to work holding a string line because redemption without labor is just a press release. The inspector returned with a roll of orange fencing and a sense of humor about retroactivity. The roundhouse wasn't a dream now. It was a to-do list with teeth and money with a mandate. It was also, the town learned, 100 decisions a day that would make someone mad and someone else inspired. Rhea became bilingual in Grant and Grit. Tilda wrote a piece that made a retired carpenter cry and then show up at dawn. Pastor Leon blessed the building and the budget. Irene brought a box of tickets from 1938 and insisted they be reprinted with the word admit stuck out on them like a tongue, because a joke that lasts 80 years deserves another turn. Work orders bloomed in chalk on the freight dock wall. Lead abate, Friday. Electrical, inspection Tuesday, truss lift, sat, pray for clear skies. The Hoodies formed a crew called the Switchmen and learned to splice rope and conduit under Leon's amended Beatitudes, blessed are the overbuilt, for they shall inherit the storm. And Rhea learned the geometry of trust. Every morning she stood in the middle of the hall and pressed the tuning fork to the new steel into her own sternum, reminding both what it felt like. It steadied her voice in meetings and her hands at height. The building sang back in tiny ways, fewer rattles, more purrs, the kind of small compliances a patient gives when it believes in the surgeon. They built the stage with a curve, so sound could hold people. They lined the back wall with old suitcase halves as diffusers because nothing says welcome like a well-traveled thing agreeing to live here. They embedded the brass plate, Miriam's badge, into the proscenium so that every performer would step across it, a threshold of promise. If you call, we will answer. When the ridge beam finally lifted, it felt like a town putting a crown on. The crane hummed, the slings held, and Rhea, 50 feet up, spoke to the wood like a friend who had waited politely for someone to build stairs. Easy. Yes. There. She fastened the final structural bolt and felt the entire roof exhale into her shoulder blades, which is not possible and also exactly happened. The first night they tested the room for real, thunder stacked over the river like luggage. Rhea took it as consent. The engineer returned with 2 crewmen and a case of station oilers, because some men know there are 100 ways to keep a town smooth. Leon brought his church's battered upright piano and 3 ladies who could harmonize a hurricane into a gentleman. Irene came in pearls. Open rehearsal, Tilda wrote on a sign. Leave your money. Bring your hunger. June rolled up a cart of soldering irons and carefully labeled boxes, resistor, CAP, LED, and the other kind, because a maker lab is just a choir with voltage. Rhea stood backstage in the shadow that smells like dust and prelude. For a moment, she pressed her forehead to the old brick and breathed until her hands stopped making fists. She could hear the rail humming under the floor. The 2 a.m. freight was early tonight, or the room had learned how to summon echoes of its favorite conversation. Ready? Leon whispered. Ready, she said, and but for the A in her pocket she might have fallen. The lights rose, not the borrowed chandeliers now but the proud, legal ones on a dimmer board June had claimed as her throne. The roundhouse looked like the station's best self and its own future at the same time. The audience, neighbors in their good denim, kids half feral with bedtime, tired men who'd bathed their hands twice, lifted their faces toward the stage like sunflower heads toward weather. Rhea walked out. The hall's hush pressed its palm to her back and guided her forward. She stopped at the mic and let the silence grow until it became a partner instead of a threat. When we first opened that door, she said, we found the letter. It told us that a station is a place for arrival and departure. This one asked to be a place you could arrive at even when you didn't know you were leaving someplace bad. A place you could depart from without losing yourself. A place for listening. Welcome. The piano began. The 3 church ladies braided their voices and hung them from the rafters like lanterns. A boy from shop class played a violin that had learned its vowels. An old man read a poem he'd found in his father's lunch pail the day they boarded up the express room, and halfway through it he cried and kept going. The engineer stood in the back with his cap in his hands. Councilman Strode clapped on 2 and 4 with a devotion that felt like penance. Between acts, June dimmed the house and brightened the aisle bulbs with show-off fingers and whispered to Rhea, there are 7 kids in the lab. 1 built a radio. It picked up the scanner. He's listening to trains. Teach him to listen with his hands, too, Rhea said. And to turn down the volume when the world needs a breath. Toward the end, with rain starting to comb its wet fingers through the eaves, Rhea invited Irene up to the proscenium and put the tuning fork in her palm. Would you do us the honor, she asked, of telling the room what note it is? Irene smacked the fork against her wedding ring and touched it to the beam. The hum poured into wood. The roof answered in E-flat, as it had always done, a little proud to be asked. A few in the audience laughed the laugh that is really a cry. The engineer lifted 2 fingers, a signal old as semaphore. Out on the line, it was a miracle or a schedule, the freight horn replied, 3 short, 1 long. The room turned the horn into harmony. It should have ended there, tidy as a ribbon. But towns don't write like that. Tomorrow arrived with a headline and a fight. Auto F-Town developer offers TO by Depot for mixed use, Tilda's paper read, because printers have to print what stands on their porch. A man in a carefully wrinkled shirt from a city with more vowels said the Depot would make a fantastic food hall with a curated artisanal vibe. He had trademarks in his briefcase and a smile that could butter stale bread. He also had numbers generous enough to wake up the council's greed. Rhea set the paper down like it might bite. In her pocket, the tuning fork stayed perfectly, defiantly A. She looked up at the brass plate set into the proscenium and read its circle aloud to herself, Common House, if you call, we will answer. She called. She called everyone who had held a 2x8, everyone who had thrown a switch, everyone who had cried when the bumper post held. She called the engineer. She called the inspector. She called a lawyer who had once been a switchman before a college made him a fancy kind of fighter. She called Miriam Jessup, through the letter, and asked her to sit in the front row of her resolve. They packed the council chamber until the oxygen had to share. The developer spoke in glass, renderings, sight lines, future foot traffic measured in imaginary lattes. He used the word activation until even he got tired of it. He said, community, in a way that meant customers. Rhea waited her turn and then stood, hands empty, voice steady. We don't need a place to sell each other things we can't afford, she said. We need a place to be with each other when the plant shuts down or the river rises or the train forgets its brakes. We have one. We made it. We're keeping it. She held up the brass plate, and the room changed shape. She read Miriam's letter into the minutes. She put Tilda's photograph on the overhead until even the developer looked like he wanted to clap for the night he hadn't been at. She spoke about the fun and the interest and the trust and the promise that had lived inside a box for 83 years waiting for hands to be brave enough to open it. June stood, too. She is small, but small as a lever. You can build your food hall somewhere else, she said, and the room laughed the dangerous laugh of unanimity. We built this so kids like me don't have to leave to learn how to make things. Strode, to his credit, said, I am sorry, into a microphone, and meant it. The vote wasn't close. The developer packed his trademarks and left with a gust of cologne and hurt feelings. That night, the roundhouse threw open its doors, not in victory but in relief, which is a better fuel. A fiddle tune unspooled and braided round the rafters until even the shy people had to admit their toes were attached to their joy. The engineer danced with Irene. Garner danced with physics and nearly fell off the freight dock. Rhea danced with June and then stood alone on the edge of the stage and let herself feel what she'd kept in the stern room behind her ribs, not pride, exactly, not triumph. Placement. Being exactly where you've been headed the whole time. Work didn't slow. The second month brought a leak that tested their tar and patience. The third brought a child's broken arm, a fall from the Maker Lab ladder that taught them to add rails and soften floors and write rules like blessings instead of scolds. The fourth brought 2 grants, one from the State Arts Council, one from a foundation run by a woman who had learned violin in a train station 1,000 miles away and had been waiting for an excuse to send thanks backward through time. By summer, the roundhouse had its own calendar. Mondays, open bench, bring what's broken. Tuesdays, town hall that is not a fight. Wednesdays, dance. Thursdays, choir and soldering. Fridays, film. Saturdays, maker market with a strict rule that at least half of all booths must teach something. Sundays, close the building, open the porch, listen to trains. Over and over, small emergencies found them and were swallowed whole. A heat wave night when the power blinked and the roundhouse became a cooling center with iced towels and quiet. A teenager who ran away and then ran to the depot instead and slept on the stage until his mother's fear learned how to speak. An old man whose wife died and who sat in the back pew every night until the roof hummed the note that let him stand again. And then, because stories returned to their first chords, the horn one evening came ragged again. Not brakes this time. Fire. A spark somewhere upriver had taken to grass that had taken to timber that had leaned into wind that had decided to be cruel. The slope above the yard wore orange. Cinders fell like a slow rain. Rhea looked at the ceiling and then at the brass plate. She didn't wait to be noble. Call, she said, and June called, and the engineer was already calling back. Engines that normally dragged freight rolled in like cavalry. Men in denim and soot became a line between flame and houses. Women with barrels and hoses and old skills no one had bothered to write down stood on roofs and said, "Not today." The roundhouse opened every door. It became a commissary, a dormitory, a dispatch office, a prayer. The piano played under ash. The Maker Lab printed brackets to fix a broken pump. The switchman ran water lines in a geometry that made a math teacher cry into a sandwich. Toward dawn, when the orange finally dimmed to guilty pink, Rhea walked out onto the freight dock and watched the line of tired men and women in yellow helmets trudge past and accept paper cups like sacraments. The engineer paused beside her and put a hand like a shovel blade on her shoulder. "You built this," he said, nodding at the room behind them where 100 needs had been met without fuss. "You built inside a station the thing we always said stations were supposed to be." "I only listened," Rhea said. "Miriam told us what to do." He tipped his cap toward the proscenium where the brass plate shone like a coin in a fountain. "She would be loud proud." Rhea looked out at the tracks where morning found its old job again. The rails were black lines under a sky that had decided to be gentle. The town was a diagram of solved problems and problems forgiven. "You know," she said, not to him but to the building and the people and the history in her own bruised, stubborn heart. I thought we were making a haul. Turns out we made a mouth and an ear. A thing that speaks and listens in the same breath. He nodded like men who fix things nod when someone else finally says the simple true sentence everyone had been working around. The Roundhouse's first anniversary came with fewer speeches than you'd expect and more pies. Irene wore her pearls again and made a list of everyone who had ever opened a door in that place and then made a slightly longer list of those who had knocked. Leon baptized the new exit signs with a humor that made safety feel like a psalm. Strode, in a good hat, admitted he had been wrong, and the town forgave him in the way towns do when confession offers them a chance to like themselves better. A kid named Theo, small, serious, hair like he'd tried to solder it, stood on the stage and showed the radio he'd built. It could catch the whisper of a train a county away. The engineer stood beside him and taught him how to say what he heard in ways that made trackmen smile and dispatchers send cookies. When the freight came that night, it was on time, modest as a friend. The horn did its 3-1. The roof hummed E-flat. Rhea touched the tuning fork to the beam and felt the note go up her arm and into her teeth and settle there like a permanent yes. She collected 100 scraps that evening, notes from pockets, programs with doodles, a bolt that had fallen from someone's pocket and a marriage proposal written in pencil on the back of a repair receipt, and slid them into the express room ledger's empty back pages, because some promises deserved to breed. After the last plate was washed and the last kid had been sent home with a lecture about sleep, Rhea stood alone in the hall and let the empty talk to her. Buildings do that when you let them. They rehearse tomorrow. Okay, she told it. Tomorrow we fix the rain gutter. Next week the ridge cap on the north side. In the fall we start the kids on welding bands. She laughed. You like that? I know. She looked at the brass plate one more time before she turned out the lights. The words caught a sliver of moon. If you call, we will answer. She didn't have to call. She had built the answer inside the question. Outside, the rails ticked as they cooled. Somewhere up the line a fox padded across a trestle and didn't fall. The town slept like a man who had finally forgiven himself for needing other people. Rhea turned the key in the roundhouse door and felt the old lock tuck itself in. She stepped down to the ballast and walked the line toward home, her boots ringing a small, perfect A with every other step. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications.